Rain stitched the afternoon together in 1,000 glimmering threads, and she stood at the window counting them, because numbers were kinder than choices. Cobblestones shone like mirrors in the lane below. Carriages threw fans of water against the curb. A boy in a cap splashed through a puddle with the reckless joy of someone who did not yet know what debt was. Lady Isabella Montgomery pressed her palm to the cool glass until the damp leached the heat from her skin, then drew back and folded her hands with careful poise, the sort of poise her mother had taught her for drawing rooms, not for catastrophes. Behind her, paper rasped. Her father was rereading the letter again, as if a fresh look might transform ink into mercy. "Your hair is undone," he said without looking up. "You should put it right. You may be called upon this evening." "Called upon?" Her voice sounded calmer than she felt. "By whom precisely, father? The butcher, the proprietor who holds our note? Or the nobleman who has never met me but intends to buy me like a parcel of land?" The Earl of Westmoreland set the letter down with hands that shook despite the ring still loose on his knuckle. His once imposing shoulders seemed to have caved inward, as if the weight of the townhouse, the unpaid bills, the whispers, all pressed on the same tired bones. "Isabella." "I am listening," she said, because the obedient word was an old habit, and because defiance would not summon coin from air. He stood and crossed to her. The years had turned the silver at his temples brighter and his eyes softer, contrition cutting deep new lines. "I never wanted this for you." "What do you want for me?" She tilted her head. Rainlight made her reflection a pale ghost in the window. "I am 22. The marriage mart has closed its book upon me twice over. The season was not kind. Finances were less kind. And the world—" She caught herself before bitterness grew teeth. "What is decided?" "The Duke of Blackthorn has agreed." He said it softly, K&T hard as stones in a river. "His solicitor will finalize everything before Michaelmas. The settlement clears our debts. He will provide for you, and you—" He faltered, and she understood he could not bring himself to finish the sentence. "You will provide an appearance of domestic order. You will host. You will raise his children. You will be silent where it pleases him." "Do you know him?" she asked. "I know his reputation." "So do the papers," she murmured. "I've read them. A man of Parliament who speaks rarely and always wins. Interests in coal, in shipping, in a dozen ventures that turn soot into gold. A widower. 2 daughters. She let the last words hover. "They say he hasn't smiled since his wife died. They say he refused all callers for a year. They say he sits in a black coach and never looks out the window." "People say a great many things when they envy power," her father answered. But the line around his mouth admitted that rumours, like water, seeped through every wall if given time. He offered the letter, and she took it. Even the paper felt expensive, thick, slightly toothed, the crest in blue wax as pure and cold as ice. The phrasing was impeccable. No tenderness, no insult. Arrangements, terms. The word suitable read like a verdict. Isabella folded it back along its tidy crease and returned it. "Will he call?" "He will be at Harrington House tomorrow night." A pause. "You will be introduced there. It is to be efficient." "Efficient," she repeated, and found the shape of the word both laughable and lethal. In one syllable, the severing of futures she had half imagined in the quiet of her own mind. A bookshop with a bell that rang when she walked in. not because she would ever be permitted to keep such a shop, but because she loved the hush in places where pages spoke. A cottage borrowed in spring, hedgerows white with bloom, where she could forget her surname for a month. A marriage to a man who noticed the way she loved the first hour after dawn. Efficient filed such dreaming into a drawer and turned the key. Martha, her maid, knocked gently and entered with a tray. "You haven't eaten, my lady." "Thank you, Martha." Isabella kept her voice steady as she lifted the lid from the soup and found it had skinned over in the time since it left the kitchen. She broke the film with the back of the spoon and tried not to think of how very many things in this house had acquired a film lately. Silver needing polish they could not afford, curtains thin enough to show the seams, hope placed on high shelves to gather dust. Martha's eyes flicked between father and daughter, and, reading a weather she had learned to read years ago, busied herself with a pointless straightening of the mantle. "Will you consent?" the Earl asked, quieter. Isabella set the spoon down before it could clatter. Consent was a generous word, draped over a scaffolding of necessity. Yet she was not a child. No one could speak the word for her. Somewhere beneath the obedience, there was a branch of iron in her. It had not bent when their carriages were sold. It had not bent when acquaintances cut her at Almack's with smiles like knives. It did not bend now. "Yes," she said. She surprised herself with the softness of it. In truth, she had decided in the first instant she grasped whose name sat above the crest. The first duty of a drowning person is to breathe for two. "I will do it. I will do it properly." Her father sagged and caught himself. "I am in your debt." "We are in each other's," she answered, because love was a ledger she refused to keep. After he left, night drew its shawl across the city. Lamps bloomed one by one along the street, each a small promise with a wick. Isabella sat at her dressing table while Martha coaxed pins from her hair. The mirror held a woman with a steady mouth and eyes too green to be fashionable in a face too serious for her age. She touched the little portrait of her mother that sat at the frame's edge, the enamel cracked where it had been loved. "What would you advise?" she whispered to someone who could not answer. She imagined the reply anyway. "Hold your head high. Do not confuse kindness with weakness. Remember that all great houses are only rooms full of people who get hungry and tired and afraid." "I could send for Miss Philby to add lace to the ivory gown," Martha said, half entreaty, half practicality. "The embroidery is fine, but a touch of newness. We cannot pay her. She will let it stand on account. She always has." "Just a fresh ribbon," Isabella said. "Green." The next afternoon, carriages turned the curve of Berkeley Square like dark fish circling a lamp. Harrington House drew the city's brightest as the rain gave way to a sky rinsed clean and chandeliers piled their light atop the sun's last gold. The receiving line moved with a choreography practiced and weary. Names were said, names were forgotten. Isabella felt the eyes, gentle pity from ladies who read the ledgers of birth and fortune as if they were the Bible. Curiosity from younger girls who decided everything at a glance, contempt from a pair of dowagers who had once been kind to her when kindness cost nothing, and now discovered it cost more than they were willing to pay. Lady Harrington, benevolent, bustling, took Isabella's gloved hands and squeezed them with a pressure that might have been sympathy, might have been merely habit. "My dear," she said, and let the phrase be elastic enough to fit any circumstance. "I've a mind to show you the new conservatory. All the rage. Come, you must be introduced to—" She broke off and brightened.
to everyone.
Everyone, in this case, became chatter, card tables, a quartet playing a waltz that stirred threads of old longing in Isabella's chest. Not for partners who would spin her until the room blurred, but for the quick, weightless interlude when music makes a person her own. She looked once at the door because she could not help it. He did not enter like thunder. He entered as if he belonged to the floorboards, and they to him. The butler's announcement rode over the music and the talk. His Grace, the Duke of Blackthorn. The syllables were not loud, but the room tilted toward them. The space around him opened as though instinct, human, animal, made space for danger or for gravity. He was tall, but many men are tall. He was properly made, but many men are. The difference was the silence he carried, not awkwardness, not shyness, a chosen absence. He had black hair cut close enough to keep its order, and not so close as to erase the hint of wave. The austerity of his mouth made the line of his nose seem aristocratic rather than severe. The famous eyes were a grey that did not catch easy light. Isabella realized belatedly that she had been holding her breath, and let it go at the same moment Lady Harrington's hand came to rest on her elbow. "There he is," the hostess said in a tone one uses for tigers on leashes. "You must meet him at once." "Must I?" Isabella said, very low. "My dear," Lady Harrington replied without moving her smile at all, "you must." He watched them cross to him and did not pretend otherwise. It was not impoliteness. It was the refusal to wear the mask most men put on for society. He bowed appropriately to Lady Harrington, and appropriately less to Isabella, and those proper degrees were a first lesson. He knew the scale of all things. Up close, the impression of contained force sharpened. He smelled faintly, not of cologne, but of clean wool and ink and a winter garden. She had not expected the last, and could not say why it surprised her. "Your Grace," Lady Harrington sang out, "may I present Lady Isabella Montgomery?" Lady Isabella. His voice was the voice she had imagined on the page, low, cool, cultured by tutors, and honed by argument. He took her hand, and heat surprised her in the steadiness of his grasp. "Your Grace," Isabella said. Her curtsy would scandalize no one. One does not fall to one's knees in a ballroom for a man one has not yet married. She lifted her head. If she had been a more beautiful woman, perhaps she would have tried to strike him like a spark with it. Instead, she did the only thing she trusted. She showed him her intelligence in the clarity of her gaze and waited to see if he would flinch. He did not. His inspection was swift and clinical, but it was not unkind. He gave a small nod, as if a column had balanced in his head. "I understand we are to be well acquainted." "So I am told," she answered. "Are you fond of dancing?" Lady Harrington asked brightly, panic nibbling at the edges of her brightness, because the air between the two of them was not the air of flirtation and would not be coaxed into it. "I participate when custom requires," the Duke said. "I enjoy music," Isabella offered, because stubbornness was a poor chaperone and she would not make an enemy of a silence. "And occasionally, when the waltz is a good one, I forget to count." A shade of something that was not quite amusement brushed his mouth. "Forgetting to count is a luxury," he said, and the words were so unexpected and so true that she felt an absurd urge to laugh. Lady Harrington, relieved by any sign that conversation might continue without collapsing, clapped her hands softly. "There, then, the quartet is excellent, and the floor very smooth. Your Grace, you must claim Lady Isabella for the first waltz." "I must?" He looked at the hostess with the faintest inquiry, then at Isabella. "If Lady Isabella wishes it." "I am content either way," Isabella said, which was true and a lie in equal measure. She had no wish to court him with spectacle. She had an equal wish to see how he moved in a pattern that demanded trust. "Then we are agreed," he said, and offered his arm without flourish. They took their place at the edge of the floor as couples arrayed themselves like chessmen. When the first bar unfurled, he placed his hand against her back, and she discovered that he led exactly as she expected, without error and without heat. Precision took them into the turn. Precision set the distance between their bodies. Precision made stopping and starting both clean. She had danced with boys who tried to disguise their eagerness with swagger, and with men who mistook a dance for a proposition. This was neither. If there was any pulse beneath the habit, he did not permit it to alter the step. "Your daughters," she said when she found breath, and his fingers at once became stone. "What of them?" "I wondered how they prefer to spend their afternoons." He looked down at her in a way that told her he had been asked a question like this a handful of times in his life, and never by anyone who could insist on an answer. "They are at lessons in the morning and take fresh air afterward." "Do they climb trees?" The question slipped out before she could confine it. "I have not encouraged it." "Ah." She turned under his arm. "I suppose it scuffs the shoes." "It breaks necks." "You are not wrong," she said. "But sometimes the world convinces a child that her body is meant for smallness and stairs and the corners of rooms. A tree can persuade her otherwise. Persuasion is not to be despised." "I see," he said, in a tone that meant he did not see at all, and resented that he did not. She should have been cautious. She was cautious. And yet she had promised herself one truth for every 10 courtesies tonight, or she would not recognize the sound of her own voice by morning. "They will need more than order." "They have what they require," he said, smooth and final as a door closing. "For now," she allowed. "They are 5 and 7, if the papers can be believed." He didn't ask which papers. "You have taken an interest." "It would be a poor beginning if I had not." The turn brought them past a gilt mirror and flashed them back as if from a future already decided. His dark head bent, her white-gloved hand small in his, 2 figures fitting a pattern drawn by strangers. He looked down at her again, not clinically now, but with the faintest irritation that could have been curiosity in disguise. "Why agree to what you do not want?" he asked. "Because it is not only about what I want," she said, and felt the iron branch inside her stir. "Because debts do not pay themselves. Because I can count without being a miser about it. Because a woman may choose duty and still keep a private soul." The music swelled and slipped beneath them. It should have made her lighter. Instead, she felt the floor rise, as if the tide had come in and lifted every board's hidden buoyancy. "And you, Your Grace," she said after a moment, "why agree to what you do not want?" He considered. Honesty, or something like it, moved under the skin of his face like a fish under water. "Efficiency," he said at last, and the word in his mouth was both joke and shield. "My daughters require oversight, the house requires a mistress, and society requires that a man of my station not let certain questions linger." "Questions are persistent," she said. "They tend to linger whether we tidy them away or not." The waltz unspooled its last ribbon of sound and tied it neatly. He let her go at the exact moment one should. He bowed. She curtsied. In all the things that can be measured, they had been perfect. Her father was at her elbow before the applause died. She registered the triumph and the fear in him, twin sparks in a man standing too close to the edge of a cliff, but insisting he liked the view. The Duke acknowledged the Earl with the precise correctness the situation required, and no overspill. "We will conclude the practicalities promptly," he said, as if they were discussing the shipment of slate. "I am in town until Friday." "Your Grace is too good," the Earl replied, meaning anything but. "Lady Isabella," the Duke said, turning back to her, "I shall call tomorrow afternoon with my solicitor. There are items to review." A fractional pause, not quite deference, not quite warning. "I prefer clarity." "As do I," she said, and lost the fight not to smile, because if she did not learn to laugh at the absurd theatre of her life, she would cry for a month. He inclined his head and was gone into the stream of congratulations that adhere to powerful men without anyone deciding to attach them. Isabella. Her father used her name the way he had used it when she was 6 and had climbed out a nursery window onto the low roof to rescue a cat that did not want rescuing. "You did well." "I danced," she said. "I answered questions. I asked 2 of my own." The earth still keeps to its axis. Before they left, she stood alone for a moment beneath a painted ceiling where gods pretended to float on clouds. She did not pray. The last time she had tried, her words had fluttered like moths and died against a pane of something she could not see. Instead, she made a small, secular vow. "I will not be cowed. If I must barter one future for another, I will drive the best bargain I can for myself and for those girls whose names I have learned without permission." When the carriage door shut on the night's perfume and chatter, the city's sounds returned scrubbed and honest. Hoofbeats, a newsboy's call, the sigh of wheels. Her father exhaled the way men exhale when the surgeon says the operation will be necessary, and soon. "Thank you," he said into the dark. She pressed her gloved knuckles to her mouth and tasted damp kid leather and salt. "We will be all right," she answered, making a promise she did not know how to keep, and deciding in the same instant to become the kind of woman who learns the map of a promise and walks it line by line. The next day, punctual to the minute, the Duke arrived with a man whose coat was too fashionably cut for a solicitor, but whose eyes had the careful dryness of one. Isabella had chosen the small morning room for the interview. It was unassuming, and the light there was true. She did not want the making of her life to happen in a place of gilt and false gold. Her father was present, of course, and 2 footmen who pretended to be invisible. Tea sat on a tray between them like a ceremony someone had forgotten the words for. Papers were produced, terms recited. There was propriety to it all, and a cold competence that turned her throat to sand. She asked the questions she had written the night before, about the children's guardianship, about the house in town and the house in the country, about pin money, not because she cared for trinkets, but because money meant leverage when a woman had no vote and no seat and no recognized right to her own mind. The Duke watched her and did not interrupt when the solicitor tried to skate over a clause she did not like. She insisted, and it was changed. His mouth twitched, not with displeasure, she realized, but with what, in a kinder man, might have been admiration. When all was signed but the final signature, he said, without preamble and without looking at the Earl, I will expect that the Montgomery accounts are not harassed again. We're grateful, her father began, his voice rough. This is not gratitude, the Duke said. It is a condition of the contract. I do not enjoy dealing twice with the same problem. Nor do I, Isabella said into the sudden silence, and for a fleeting second an understanding passed between them as clean as a knife. Neither of us is sentimental about the ugliness that must be done. When the men stood to leave, he turned at the doorway. It was the first time he had faced her privately, strictly speaking, though others remained in the room. The grey of his eyes made her think of the sea beyond the harbour wall on a day just before storm. I do not make promises I cannot keep, he said. I will not be a demonstrative husband. I will not pretend what I do not feel. You will be treated with respect. You will have authority in the running of the household. My daughter's upbringing will be your charge. If you can accept these terms, we will do as we have agreed. Her heart, absurd traitor, shivered once, and then learned stillness again. She inclined her head. I prefer plain speech, she said. And I have no taste for false romance. Respect is a beginning. Children require kindness. A household requires justice. I can supply both. He looked at her for a long moment, as if measuring a weight no scale could take. Very well, he said, and left. 3 weeks later, St. George's held a thin congregation and a thick hush. Isabella wore ivory because one does, and because it cast a little light upward against a face that had not slept as it should. The Duke waited at the altar, not a bridegroom precisely, more like a man waiting for the signing of a treaty he intends to keep and intends never to think of again. The vows themselves were simple enough to speak. She had practiced not trembling. She succeeded. When the time came to kiss, he bent and brushed her mouth with nothing in it. That, too, she had expected. What she had not expected, though in retrospect she should have, was the thing he chose to say when the priest stepped back and the witnesses rustled and the organ made its modest music. He leaned as if to adjust the angle of her veil, and for a heartbeat the distance between them was only breath. My heart died with the mother of my daughters, he said quietly, without malice, without pity, as if he were informing her of the hour or the weather. Do not look for what cannot be given. Her spine straightened as if someone had set a rod down it. The words landed as a weight, and then, as weights sometimes do when a person is strong enough, became a counterweight, a balance against which she could press her whole self and find leverage. She lifted her eyes and met his. Then we shall give the living what remains, she said, because pride and promise are cousins, and she would not let his grief write every line of her future. The door opened onto the waiting world. Bells rang because bells are rung when papers are signed and hands are joined and wheels begin to turn. The rain had spent itself. The city smelled new. In the carriage he did not speak, and she did not, and the silence, for once, felt like fabric she could learn to cut and sew. She thought of small hands she had not yet held, of lessons she would unlearn, of trees that might be climbed with care and supervision, of rooms where routine could be kept without cruelty. She thought of the iron branch within her. She thought of counting, and of the rare, necessary courage of sometimes forgetting to. The carriage wheels beat a steady rhythm against the road, yet inside the coach there was no rhythm at all, only silence that seemed deeper than the gathering dusk. Isabella sat across from the man who was now her husband, and though they shared the same small space, they might as well have been miles apart. He had spoken scarcely 20 words since they left St. George's. His attention was fixed on a leather folio balanced on his knee, filled with reports and letters that apparently mattered more than the new wife seated opposite him. The veil still pinned in Isabella's hair trembled each time the carriage lurched, but he did not glance up, did not notice. She turned her gaze outward. The landscape changed as London receded behind them, chimneys fading into hedgerows, stone giving way to fields, the last lamps of the city becoming faint stars in the rear window. With each mile, Isabella felt her old life slip further away. The cramped townhouse with its faded curtains, her father's weary shoulders, the streets she had known since girlhood. Before her lay a vast unknown, a manor spoken of in whispers, and two small daughters who had lost their mother before they could remember her voice. Her mind returned to the words whispered at the altar, the words that had cut more cruelly than any blade. "My heart died with the mother of my daughters." He had not meant her to hear the anguish beneath them, but she had. His grief was real, but so was the wall it had built around him. Isabella pressed her hands together in her lap. She had promised herself that she would not be diminished by this marriage. If his heart was entombed in memory, she would still live fully, and she would not let two little girls grow up in a house where tenderness was forbidden. Hours passed before the carriage turned beneath ancient oaks, their branches interlaced like cathedral arches. The iron gates creaked open and closed behind them with finality. There it was at last. Blackthorn Manor, rising out of the twilight like some stern sentinel. Its wings stretched wide, its windows glowed faintly with scattered light, yet the stone itself seemed colder than the night. Isabella drew a breath, willing herself to admire rather than fear. "It is magnificent," she said softly. 400 years of history," the Duke replied, the first trace of emotion, pride, in his voice since the vows. The coach halted before a double row of liveried servants. The butler, Hawkins, stepped forward, bowing deeply. "Welcome home, Your Grace." "And welcome, Your Grace," he added, turning to Isabella with courtly solemnity. She thanked him with as much warmth as she could gather. The Duke wasted no time. "Have the children been brought down?" "Yes, Your Grace. They await in the blue drawing-room." A ripple of anticipation coursed through Isabella. She gathered her courage as he led her through the great hall, its portraits watching, its ceiling arching high above. At the open doors, two small figures stood stiffly beside their governess. Charlotte, the elder at 7, curtsied with practiced perfection. Emma, only 5, tried to copy her but nearly tipped sideways. Both girls wore identical blue frocks, their faces solemn as miniature adults. Kneeling, Isabella brought herself eye-level with them. "I am so pleased to meet you both," she said, her smile steady. "I hope we shall be good friends." Charlotte repeated the formal welcome she had been taught. Emma echoed it, her small voice nearly swallowed by the vast room. Something in Isabella's chest ached. "Perhaps," she said gently, "when we are alone, you might simply call me Isabella. Your Grace feels far too formal for family." The governess, Miss Winters, frowned in swift disapproval. "The young ladies have been instructed in proper address, Your Grace. Familiarity breeds carelessness." Isabella rose with composure intact. "Of course, Miss Winters, I would never wish to undermine your guidance. Yet even in the finest households there is a time for formality and a time for family warmth." The Duke dismissed the children soon after, but Isabella requested to accompany them to their nursery. He hesitated, clearly unused to having his wishes pressed, then nodded curtly. So it was that Isabella followed two uncertain girls up the grand staircase, Miss Winters gliding behind like a shadow. The nursery was immaculate. Charts on the walls, books stacked neatly, every toy hidden from sight. It was the sort of order that stifled rather than soothed. At bedtime, Isabella requested to read them a story. Miss Winters objected, citing routine. Isabella's voice remained calm but firm. "Tonight is special. As their new mother, I would like this privilege." So she told them of a brave princess who saved her kingdom with kindness and cleverness, not swords. Emma's eyes widened with wonder. Charlotte listened in quiet reserve, but a flicker of interest softened her face. When Isabella tucked them in, Emma whispered, "I like that story better than the duck one." "Then tomorrow," Isabella promised, "we shall have another." That night, long after she had retired to her chambers, a soft knock disturbed her thoughts. Emma stood there in her nightgown, clutching a worn, stuffed rabbit. "Mr. Whiskers wanted to say good night again," she murmured, eyes wide with fear of being discovered. Isabella knelt, smoothing the child's gown. "Then we shall let him. And tomorrow, another story, I promise." She returned Emma to her bed, kissed her brow, and whispered, "You could never be a burden." When Isabella stood again at her own window, moonlight silvering the gardens below, she understood with clarity. The Duke might keep his heart locked in mourning, but the children still breathed, still needed warmth. She would give it. She would bring light where shadows reigned. And so the second chapter of her life began, not with love returned, but with her own resolve, strong as steel beneath silk, to claim dignity, to nurture innocence, and to stand unyielding in the cold halls of Blackthorn Manor. Morning seeped into the manor not in gold, but in a careful grey, as if even daylight had learned to lower its voice here. Isabella rose before the household gong and let Lily fasten the simple day gown she had chosen, a soft wool the blue of a robin's egg, subdued enough to be proper in a house that disapproved of joy in bright colours. While Lily coiled her hair, Isabella memorized the map of the day as Hawkins had explained it the night before. Breakfast in the small dining room at 8, nursery lessons from 9 until noon, a walk if weather and governess allowed, needlework, French, handwriting, tea, prayers, bed. A clockwork child is a triumph to those who wind the keys, she thought, and not always a triumph to the child. She took her tea in 3 quick swallows and was at the nursery door as the clock struck 9. Miss Winters opened to her knock with the expression of a woman braced for contagion. "Your Grace," she said, the honorific polished into a blade. "Good morning, Miss Winters." Isabella stepped into rooms so tidy they seemed to hold their breath. Charlotte and Emma sat at a small table, backs straight, slates clean. A single doll, plain, unremarkable, watched from a shelf as if uncertain of her welcome. "May I observe?" "It is not customary," Miss Winters replied. "Customs may be adjusted," Isabella said gently. "I will be quiet as a mouse." Emma wriggled, torn between excitement and the fear of breaking a rule without knowing which it was. Charlotte, self-command personified, arranged her slate and wrote out dates with a neat hand. Their copywork was impeccable, their French verbs an ordered march. When Miss Winters called for scripture, Charlotte recited without stumbling. Emma stumbled once and coloured, and Miss Winters' correction was exact and not unkind. but it landed with far more weight than the little error warranted. After an hour, Isabella requested a small change. "Might we combine handwriting practice with something the girls have chosen?" "What they have chosen," Miss Winters repeated, as if it were a foreign language she distrusted. "Subjects," Isabella said. "Topics that interest them. The hand thrives when the mind is engaged." Charlotte looked momentarily adrift, as if the word interest were a road without signposts. Emma's hand shot up and then froze at Miss Winters' glance. Isabella nodded to her. "Yes, my dear?" "Birds," Emma whispered. "I like the ones that hop." "Wrens," Isabella smiled. "A delightful choice." She turned to Charlotte. "And you?" Charlotte's slate remained a shield in front of her. "History," she said, carefully neutral. "We are compiling a timeline of kings." "Excellent," Isabella said. "Let us have 3 lines today. Wrens with an observation, and a date from English history that pleases you, and 1 sentence each about something you wish to learn tomorrow." Miss Winters made a sound like a page creasing. "That is not our plan." "It is our plan now," Isabella answered, without raising her voice and without moving from her small chair. To the children, "Begin." Emma wrote, "Wrens hop sideways like little commas." Charlotte, after a pause, chose the accession of Elizabeth I and wrote with elegance, "A queen who learned to carry a country alone." She added, almost too quiet to hear, "I wish to learn the capitals of the Italian states." Isabella felt that small wish in her chest like a candle taking. At 11, she closed the lesson with a game of spelling that smuggled in laughter, then rose. "We will walk," she announced. "The ground is damp," Miss Winters said. "There are puddles." "Boots," Isabella returned. "Cloaks." "Hats." She looked at the children's faces as they lit at the ordinary magic of permission. "Puddles are navigational challenges we shall meet with courage." They ventured into air that smelled of wet leaves and stone. The yews along the walk had been clipped into obedient cones, but beyond the formal paths ran a wilder edge where brambles dared the wall and blackbirds scolded anyone who came too close to their hedges. Emma reached for Isabella's hand without thinking, and forgot to drop it when Miss Winters cleared her throat. Charlotte walked beside them, not touching, but so near that the brush of her sleeve felt like trust's first cautious approach. "Does father walk here?" Emma asked once, peering up. "He does when time permits," Miss Winters replied before Isabella could. "We shall make time," Isabella murmured, and did not add for whom. At luncheon the girls ate in the nursery fare, nursery rules, while Isabella took a tray in her morning room and gave herself an hour to learn the estate in ink. Hawkins, anticipating her request, had sent the household accounts and a neat list of the names and positions of every person under the roof, from butler to scullery maid. She read all of it, not scanning but attending, because these were not numbers but the shape of a living thing. At 2:30, Hawkins announced Mr. Hughes, the steward. He was a man in his 40s, with the guarded manner of someone accustomed to being the cleverest in most rooms. He bowed with perfect respect and the mildest condescension. "Your Grace," he began, placing folders on the table with proprietary care, "I have brought the quarterly figures for the home properties and the northern interests." "His Grace is in the habit of reviewing them personally, but in his absence—" "In his absence," Isabella smiled, "you will indulge a curiosity of mine." He hesitated, then released a sheaf of papers into her keeping as if surrendering a child. She read methodically, asking questions, patient when he attempted the little detours some men reserve for women they assume will be grateful for guidance. She did not bristle. She did not need to. She asked again until the answer was the thing itself, not the ornament. "The Sheffield mine," she said at last, tapping a figure that sulked in the ledger. "Production is down. Costs up. Wages have not changed. Why?" "Market fluctuations, Your Grace," Hughes said. "Coal is a capricious trade. Veins weaken." "Perhaps," Isabella said. "Perhaps also conditions worsen." He smiled with his eyes and not his mouth. "It is a mine, Your Grace, not a dancing room." "Do children work there?" she asked. "Some few," he replied carefully. "As is customary. They fit the tunnels no man can." "Custom is often a poor defense," Isabella said. "I would like a report from the mine manager, not the customary report with its euphemisms, but a plain one. Ventilation. Supports. Any injuries in the past 6 months." Hughes clasped his hands and studied them as if they belonged to someone else. "As Your Grace wishes. I shall dispatch a rider." "Thank you." When he had gone, she sat very still, hands folded on the papers. The neat lines of ink had looked to her when she was a girl like the language of power written in a script only men could read. It turned out numbers told the truth to anyone who would listen, and what they said now did not please her. The next days she spent in a rhythm both borrowed and newly made. She attended the girls' lessons and altered them by inches, careful not to topple the structure Miss Winters believed a sacrament. She introduced a map with pins, one for every place Charlotte wished to know, and one for every bird Emma could name. She instituted what she called the 10th minute, during which each child told of something small that had made her happy before breakfast. The first day offered slim pickings. Charlotte, the smell of the slate pencil; Emma, toast. By the 4th, the offerings grew. The way light makes dust look like snow in the nursery when the curtains are open, Hawkins's cough when he tries not to laugh. Miss Winters relented in little ways, grumbling that scripture could not be replaced by such flippancy, but allowing that handwriting had improved when Emma described birds that hop like commas. It could not last without resistance. The storm broke on a late afternoon 2 weeks into Isabella's tenure, with the grey sky already pressed low against the roof. Isabella was finishing a set of notes regarding the pantry. Lily had discovered the cook had been told to put the kitchen staff on thinner rations for economy, and Isabella had reversed it when she heard sobbing in the hall, the kind of child sobbing that startles even a house long schooled in ignoring sounds that do not belong in ledgers. Emma ran into the doorway, blotched and breathless, followed by Charlotte, who wore distress like armour. "She took him!" Emma cried, flinging herself into Isabella's lap as if it were the only safe harbour on earth. "Who took whom?" Isabella asked, already knowing. "Miss Winters," Charlotte answered, steady by will alone. "She found Mr. Whiskers in Emma's drawer and said Emma was too old for such foolishness. She took him away." Isabella rose with Emma in her arms and set her down only when the child's breathing steadied. "We will ask for him back," she said, "because there are moments when an adult must make a promise without the luxury of checking its price." Miss Winters stood in the schoolroom as if she were its most important piece of furniture. The stuffed rabbit sat on a high shelf above her reach, looking ridiculously, heartbreakingly, exiled. "Your Grace," Miss Winters began, even before Isabella spoke, "I must insist upon the standards I have been hired to uphold." Lady Emma is 5 years old. She will never learn self-command if she is permitted such coddling." "Self-command," Isabella said, "does not begin with grief over a toy. It begins when an adult with power chooses mercy. Mercy breeds weakness." "On the contrary," Isabella replied evenly, "mercy requires strength, and children require gentleness." "Give the rabbit to me, Miss Winters." Miss Winters hesitated, and in that hesitation Isabella recognized everything. A small woman who had survived on the worship of rules, anger stored like savings against the day kindness would fail to pay, fear that softness invited loss. How many women had built their lives from those materials and called the edifice virtue? Too many. "If His Grace," Miss Winters began. "His Grace," Isabella said, and felt the iron branch inside her thrum with quiet authority, "has entrusted his daughters to me. You may speak to him if you wish, and we will speak together, but for now, give me the rabbit." Miss Winters reached for the shelf, snatched the toy down, and handed it over, her mouth a line of disapproval so sharp it could cut bread. Emma took Mr. Whiskers as if receiving a relic, then pressed her face into Isabella's skirt, the tremor of her small body a prayer of relief. "Thank you," Isabella told Miss Winters with genuine courtesy. "We will continue at 4 with geography. For now, the young ladies and I will be in the garden room." The garden room had an old couch with fading chintz that had been chosen by someone who loved colour and had not been replaced by someone who did not. Isabella settled with the girls, Mr. Whiskers tucked between them like a small grey ambassador. She did not speak of the quarrel. Instead, she asked, "If we were map-makers and made a map of the manor, where would we put the best hiding places?" Emma's finger drew circles on her lap. "Behind the big curtain in the blue room." "In the wardrobe, where the cedar smell lives," Charlotte said after a long pause. And when Isabella looked at her, she recognized the expression of a child who had learned not to say, "in my heart," when asked where she keeps her most precious things. "Then let us mark both," Isabella said, and they drew a pretend map with the tip of a finger on Mr. Whisker's soft head, and laughed until Emma hiccuped. That evening, Hawkins knocked at Isabella's door with a folded note. "His Grace has returned unexpectedly," he reported. "He requests a word with your Grace in the study." Requests was a generous verb in a house where some words were orders dressed in velvet. Isabella set down her pen, smoothed her skirt, and followed. The study was lamp-lit, the desk a landscape of papers. He stood at the hearth, hands clasped behind him, posture ironed into faultlessness. "You sent for me," she said. He turned, and the distance he carried like a cloak settled on his shoulders. "Miss Winters has informed me of a disturbance," he said without prelude. "I rely on her to maintain order. I will not have that order undermined by indulgence." "If the price of your order is a weeping child," Isabella replied, "you are being cheated." His eyes sharpened. "We will have clarity. I do not subscribe to sentiment." "The girls lack for nothing." "They lack for warmth," she said, not cruelly, simply because the truth wore no ornament. "They need to know love is not a prize for perfect posture." He exhaled slowly. "You have been here a fortnight, and already presume to instruct me in my own house." "I presume to care for your daughters." She kept her hands loosely folded so he would not see how tightly her nails wanted to bite her palms. "When Emma came to me, she did not seek a revolution. She sought a rabbit. There is a difference. Silence held them a moment, taut, as if the room itself doubted its own alignment. Then, to her surprise, he said, "Miss Winters will remain. Her methods are effective." "And my methods," Isabella answered, "are compassionate. We will combine them." He looked at her as if she had practiced a kind of witchcraft in which a person speaks as if her authority is not borrowed. His gaze skated to the desk, the ledgers there, the notes in her hand. "Hughes tells me you have requested additional reports regarding Sheffield." "I have." "Why?" "Because the numbers imply suffering." She stepped to the desk and laid a page there, not as a challenge, but as proof. Declining output, stagnant wages, increased accidents. When lines form such a pattern, they spell the shape of a collapse before it happens. He studied her face, not the page. "You have an interest in mining?" "I have an interest in people who go into the ground so others may sit by fires." He rubbed his thumb against a knuckle, a gesture so small she would have missed it if she had not already learned to collect his smallnesses and hold them up to light. "I will review the reports," he said at last. "Thank you." She hesitated, then added, "I intend to visit Sheffield." His gaze lifted like a blade. "You will do no such thing." "How else am I to know the truth?" "I know the truth because it is my business to know it," he said, voice smooth as the river before a weir. "You know the truth because I inform you of it. That is sufficient." "Not for me," she said. And when his mouth opened, she went on, not loudly, not even quickly, but with a steadiness that gave the words weight. "You are not the only person in this house capable of looking a fact in the face. The faintest thing, irritation or respect. In him they wore the same shirt, shifted his expression. "You will not go," he repeated, less iron in it and more habit. "Then I will send someone I trust, who is not in the manager's pocket," she said. "And I will speak with the wives. They are seldom consulted, but they are never mistaken." He turned from her and touched the mantle as if it were a compass he needed to verify. "Have you ever considered," he said to the fire, "that there is a cost to your methods? That every rearranged schedule, every challenge to a governess, every interference in an industrial matter disturbs a balance that is not yours to disturb?" "I have considered it," she said. "And I have also considered the cost of leaving things untouched when they are already wrong." He faced her again, and the light from the lamp took the hard planes of his face and made of them something almost noble. "You told me on our wedding day you preferred plain speech," he said. "Then here is mine. I do not have the capacity to be other than I am." "And I am not asking it," she answered, with a gentleness that surprised them both. "I am asking only that you look at what is before you with the eyes you already possess." He said nothing for a beat too long, then nodded, a single degree downward, as if conceding to himself, not to her. "You may continue your visits to the nursery," he said, tone formal again, but gentled from its edge. "I expect the children at dinner on Sundays." "Presented," she said, and did not quite keep the dryness from the word. "Present," he corrected quietly, and something inside her hitched, the smallest amending of a habit that had not seemed amendable. They had nearly reached a truce when he said, almost as an afterthought, "I will be in Scotland for a fortnight. There is a matter with our tenants that cannot be addressed by letter." "Then while you are away," she said, "we shall write to you. The girls have improved their penmanship markedly under the influence of pleasure." "Right," he said, in a tone that drew the word into an odd shape in his mouth, as if he had not expected to speak it. "Once each week," she said. "They will tell you of their lessons, of their small discoveries. If you answer, even with 2 lines, I will consider you my ally." The corner of his mouth moved, not enough to graduate to smile. "I will consider your terms." It was not victory, but it was not defeat. She left him to his papers and returned to the quiet of her own rooms, where Lily had lit the fire and set a little tea like a consoling friend. Isabella did not feel triumphant, nor did she regret. She felt like a person who had walked a rope stretched between 2 tall buildings and had not yet allowed her knees to shake. The next morning she wrote to her father to reassure him the house had not swallowed her whole, and tucked into the same post a note to a friend in town who knew the wives of miners by the names they never wrote on charity lists. She wrote also a short letter to herself and sealed it without reading, a habit she had taught herself in grief. A promise made in ink becomes, if not prophecy, then at least a memory one can return to and touch. "I will not be a scold or a martyr," she wrote. "I will be useful." With the Duke's departure, the household slackened, not sloppily, but with a small relief, like a muscle allowed to unclench between tasks. Isabella put that slack to good use. She reopened a long-closed room that had once belonged to the late Duchess. The conservatory, Hawkins said, a private place where music had been played and orchids had been attempted with indifferent success. The glass was clean, the plants neglected but not dead. She and the girls set about reviving what could be revived. Emma hummed, a tune that had not yet learned its own name. Charlotte read aloud from a book of explorers as Isabella trimmed the browned ends from a fern. In the afternoons, Isabella introduced a ceremony they called letters and lemon biscuits. Paper and ink and crumbs, the girls writing to their father while she composed replies to Mr. Hughes' dispatches. Miss Winters objected to crumbs near correspondence and to informalities near lessons, but grudgingly admitted Charlotte's flourishes had improved and Emma's spelling hewed closer to the word than once it had. On the 3rd day, the report from Sheffield arrived, and with it a small photograph on a card. Boys, no, children, lean and sharp-eyed as foxes, standing with lamps that seemed heavier than their arms. Isabella read the report 3 times. The language did what such language always attempts. It named horrors by their least alarming names. Incident for a shaft collapse. Lung complaint for air that stole a boy's breath by degrees. Customary practice for small bodies made to crawl where grown men would not fit. She folded the report and felt her own lungs rebel against the clean air of her pretty room. "Your Grace?" Lily had paused at the door, reading the weather of her face as easily as she could read the clouds. "Shall I take that down to Mr. Hughes?" "In a moment," Isabella said. She smoothed the paper again. "No, in an hour." She took a fresh sheet and began a letter that did not scold and did not beg. It stated, it instructed, it expected. When she finished, she rang for Hawkins. "Yes, Your Grace?" "I will go to Sheffield in 2 days," she said. He did not blink, which is why she trusted him. "I will make the arrangements," he said simply. "You will require stout boots." She smiled, a fraction. "And courage. That, Your Grace, you appear to possess." News in a great house moves like scent, swiftly, invisibly, best carried by those who never seem to speak. By the time Isabella and Hawkins were inspecting the travel coach at the side entrance on the appointed morning, Mrs. Pembroke in the kitchens had already tucked packets of rolls into a basket. Lily had sewn an extra loop on the hem of the Duchess's skirt so it would not drag in chalk dust, and the hall boy, Thomas, had polished the lanterns as if they were medals bound for glory. Miss Winters did not attend the leave-taking. She stood at the nursery window and watched with a severity that bled into worry when she thought herself unobserved. Charlotte and Emma, buttoned to their chins, stood beside the steps. "You mustn't go where it is dangerous," Charlotte said, sounding more like a wife than a child. "I mustn't," Isabella agreed, "but I must go where there are people who need me to see them." Emma thrust a folded paper into Isabella's hand. "I drew you a map," she said solemnly. "It shows where the nice things are, even if it looks grey." Isabella unfolded the paper and saw a child's brave cartography, a sun too large for the horizon, a stick figure with a hat, and, in the corner, a square labelled home. She kissed each girl in turn, forehead, temple, and the weight of their small bones in her arms felt like both anchor and sail. The road north lifted under the wheels, rougher than the polished lanes around the manor. The countryside hardened. Coal country did not try to be pretty, it tried to be honest. At Sheffield, smoke braided the air, not delicate. The faces of men and women were washed and still not clean. Isabella stepped down into a rain that was more like falling dust. Hawkins had arranged a meeting with the manager, who greeted her with astonishment he disguised poorly. "Your Grace," he said, eyeing her boots and then her expression, as if unsure which surprised him more. "It is unusual. It is necessary," she answered. "Show me everything." He tried to show her only what he wished her to see. She learned quickly to take turns he did not offer, to ask a boy to point the way rather than a foreman, to ask the woman at the door of a cottage how many candles her husband brought home for his turn below ground. She stood at the mouth of a shaft and felt the breath of earth, the cold sigh of a patient animal enduring an indignity. And then she climbed down 3 ladders and did not faint, though the air bowed her lungs and the weight of stone above felt like a lesson about mortality written without ink. She saw pit props, too few and too thin, a tunnel whose roof had been a rumour for weeks before it fell, and a little boy's fingers wrapped in linen, each fingertip a question mark, where nails would grow crooked if they grew at all. On the second day, she sat at a table in a common room that smelled of tea and damp wool and listened to the wives. They did not speak in polished sentences, but in truths. She did not take offence when a woman with a face like stone said, "What do ladies know of men coughing black?" She answered, "Less than we should, more than you think," and brought out the basket Mrs. Pembroke had sent as a friend might bring a peace offering to someone who has forgotten the word peace. She wrote as she went, notes pared to bone, orders to Hughes without embroidery. Prop the eastern run now, not next month. Pay the carpenter double for speed. Open the windows in the changing room at once. Candles for every boy. An extra shift for the pump when water rises. She added one thing that was not policy. Buy sweet buns for the children on the night after the roof is shored, and if any man calls it charity, tell him the Duchess calls it wages for days the earth took from them. When she returned to the manor, her skirt was brushed clean and her hair was civilized. But coal dust had found a way into the whorls of her skin and refused to leave. Emma sniffed at her sleeve and declared with delight, "You smell like Thomas's stove." Charlotte looked her up and down and said, with a gravity that made Isabella want to weep and laugh at once, "I will add Sheffield to the map of places I wish to know." In the evening she expected summons or censure. Neither came. Instead, a quiet, a living quiet, not the dead quiet of her first nights, settled over the house, and Isabella realized that for the first time since her wedding day she had not felt alone all day, even when no one had been beside her. Purpose had taken the chair that loneliness used to occupy, and it was the more agreeable companion. 3 nights later, the Duke returned. Hawkins announced him with the same unruffled dignity as always, but Isabella saw in his eyes the glint of a man who knows his household is less brittle than it was. The girls stood in the doorway of the library in their fresh muslins, their hair ribbons straight, their faces trying and failing to keep their composure from flying into smiles. He entered, and the air shifted the way it does when weather changes. "Good evening, father," Charlotte said, curtsy perfect, voice not quite steady. "Good evening," he answered, eyes taking them in as if he had travelled farther than Scotland to reach this spot. "Your letters arrived." Emma bounced on her toes. "Did you see the wrens?" "I did not," he said, "but I saw a lark that would have made you brave enough to climb a tree." Emma blinked, awed by the lark, by the permission. "We have practiced the gavotte," Charlotte said, because she did not yet dare say, "We missed you." "Then you must demonstrate," he replied. It came out almost like a wish. They danced, awkward and exquisite, and when a misstep tangled Emma's feet, he did not sigh as Isabella feared. He laughed briefly, as if something had startled the sound out of him. Later, when the door had closed on nursemaids and good nights, he turned to Isabella and said, in the voice of a man who has rehearsed another speech and discarded it, "Hughes tells me you went to Sheffield." "I did," she said, "and I wrote to you of what I saw and what I asked to be done." He set a hand on the back of a chair, not gripping, only connecting to the furniture as if to the argument of the house. "Your expenditures are not inconsiderable." "They are less than funerals," she said. He looked at her, and this time he did not look away. "Your assessment is thorough," he said at last. "The changes will stand." Relief did not break over her in triumph. It went through her like breath. "Thank you," she said. "You visited the shafts," he added, tone flat, to hide the thing that flickered beneath it. "Most women would not. Most men would prefer they did." Silence again, but different now, accompanied, not empty. He tapped the folded letter on the desk with his finger. "You wrote that the wives never mistake the truth." "They do not," she said. "My mother would have disagreed." "Your mother," Isabella replied gently, "might have liked me anyway." He did not smile. He did not need to. Something in him, not capitulation, not surrender, something older and more reluctant, shifted toward the living. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will speak again." "Tomorrow," she agreed, and when she returned to her room and unpinned her hair, coal dust bloomed again from the loosened coils, and she laughed, softly, alone, with a kindness for herself that felt like a gift she had earned. The following week, small changes grew roots. The girls' Sunday appearance ceased to be presentation and became presence. A quarter hour stretched to an hour when Emma's tale of a snail demanded parts and props, and Charlotte's description of Venice via maps required a pencil, a ruler, and the word lagoon. Isabella found a cupboard in the music room where a forgotten harp waited with strings that had not been tuned since the house had lowered its voice. She brought in a tuner from the village and watched Charlotte stand at the door as if listening to a ghost learning to speak again. Miss Winters clung to the old order with the desperate grip of a woman who has never been invited to trust. Isabella did not mock her for it. She gave her new scripts to recite instead, and when the governess reported a small defiance, a giggle during penmanship, an irreverent metaphor in an essay about Charles I, Isabella assigned appropriate corrections and then allowed the giggle to stand in memory as the day's proof of life. One evening near the end of the month, Isabella came upon Adrien. She had learned his name, but used it only in the privacy of her mind, standing at the conservatory door. He did not step inside. He stood as if the threshold were a border between two sovereignties, and he was considering the visa. The lantern light burned low among the leaves. The air carried damp and green, and a faint echo of something that had been, once, music. "She liked this room," he said, not turning. "So I am told," Isabella answered. "It is forgiving to mistakes. Plants do not keep score." "I do," he said. "I know." She stepped up beside him, but did not cross. "So do I." He was quiet a long time, long enough that she heard the small movements of the place, the creak of wood expanding, the shy settling of petals. When he spoke again, his voice was different, still contained, but less armored. "You are not what I expected." "Nor are you," she said. "What did you expect?" "A tyrant," she said. "Or a ghost. And what am I?" The question had no vanity in it, only weariness. "A man," she said, "which is to say, a collection of injuries and strengths, poorly catalogued and still capable of choice." He looked at her finally. The lamp caught the grey in his eyes and made them a colour the sea might be if it learned restraint. "Your words are a kind of mercy," he said. "I do not deserve them." "No one does," Isabella answered. "That is why they matter." He inclined his head, as if saluting not her but the idea. "Tomorrow," he said again, and this time the word sounded less like scheduling and more like faith. When she went to bed that night, Isabella thought of the boys in Sheffield asleep with the taste of coal in their mouths, of Miss Winters sitting upright at her small desk, copying out a verse that promised order in a world that had never provided it, of Hawkins practicing charity in the language of perfection, of Charlotte, who would choose the capitals of the Italian states over a pearl necklace, of Emma, who would choose a rabbit and be right. She thought of the man at the hearth, whose grief had built such a stern house around his heart that he had mistaken the house for the heart itself. She lay in the dark and did not feel, for once, like a thing arranged for the convenience of others. She felt, at last, arranged into the shape of herself. Morning would fold itself over the manor again, a grey napkin laid over yesterday's crumbs. She would rise and teach and write and refuse to be either scold or saint. She would be a duchess who smelled faintly of coal and rosemary, a woman who had learned to count and, when it served the living, to forget to. She would go on until the house learned the grammar of a different silence, one in which footsteps were not warnings and laughter was not trespass. She would go on until the day she could say to a man who believed his heart a tomb, "Here, listen, it still beats." The letter arrived on a Tuesday with the weather turned theatrical, clouds shouldering each other like men jostling before a fight, light falling in livid streaks. Hawkins brought the envelope on a tray as if it were a chalice. Isabella broke the seal and read the neat venom of the first paragraph twice to be certain she had not misread. "It is come to our attention," it began in a hand that smelled of printer's ink and self-importance, "that the new Duchess of Blackthorn has abandoned the modesty of her sex to parade herself in the mines of Sheffield, interfering in matters beyond her scope. Reports abound of dangerous laxity introduced by feminine caprice. Has His Grace grown so indifferent to his duties that he lets his house be governed by a lady's whims?" It was signed "A Friend to Order" and printed in the Argus, a paper that made its profit by truffling up scandal and then pretending not to eat it. She passed the page to Hawkins. "How many have seen?" "The town," he said gravely, "and by evening, London." "Very well." She set the letter down. "Then we shall be even more useful." 2 hours later, Miss Winters knocked to request an audience, rare and ominous. She sat, stiff-backed, hands clenched in her lap, and did not look at Isabella's face. "Your Grace, I have given my life to rules because they were the only friends that never left me," she said, the admission costly. "But rules have not taught me what to do when cruel men use them as swords. The girls will hear of the article. I beg you, shield them." Isabella's answer laid itself on her tongue like a promise it had been waiting for. "We will not give the girls a world in which silence is the only shield," she said. "We will give them words. We will teach them how to wield truth." In the nursery, she folded the paper and set it on the table between the girls as if it were only another copybook. Charlotte looked at it as at a test she could not revise. Emma looked at it as if it might bite. Isabella explained what it said, line by line, without varnish and without bile. When she finished, she asked, "What do we know that the writer does not?" "That you are not foolish," Charlotte said, the answer not childish loyalty, but a clear-eyed report of facts as she had observed them. Emma bent over the paper and drew a wren on the slanted margin, its beak open as if it were speaking. "That the boys were given buns," she said, "and air." They made a list, Charlotte's hand steady, Emma's letters leaning into one another like sisters on a windy day. Then Isabella tied the page with a green ribbon and said, "We shall keep this. When people say untrue things, it is good to have a record we can hold." She had barely returned to her morning room when Hawkins announced the steward, Mr. Hughes, face unusually flushed, composure polished to a high defensive shine. "Your Grace," he began before she had invited him to sit, "this publication, His Grace will be displeased." "His Grace," Isabella said, "is judicious. Judicious men prefer quiet houses. Your expeditions create noise. I have also received word from Sheffield that you have ordered expenditures beyond the budget. The northern interests cannot bear such sudden sentiment." "Sentiment?" Isabella folded her hands. "Is that what you call shoring a roof, or paying a carpenter, or candles for boys who would otherwise crawl in darkness?" He tamped his irritation down as a man tamps tobacco. "I am thinking of the long term, Your Grace. The mine must remain solvent. We must not create dependency." "Let us be very plain," she said, the iron branch steadying her voice. "The mine remains solvent because men and children go into a place that would prefer to collapse. If that reality creates a dependency on beams and air and pay for the hands that set them, I court such dependency gladly." She leaned, 2 fingers on the ledger he had brought. I will also have from you, by tonight, the list of contractors you have favoured for 3 years. Their prices are consistently dear. If your reason for continuing with them is honest, you will have no objection to showing me the arithmetic. A muscle hopped along his jaw. If His Grace has entrusted the household and the children to me, she said. The mines are kin to the household, they feed it. I answer to him gladly, for both. Tonight, Mr. Hughes. He bowed with a fineness that wanted to insult and dared not. As your Grace wishes. She waited until the door shut to let her breath out slowly. She was not a woman who enjoyed fights, but she had learned that some fights present themselves like weather. You may not invite the storm. You may be unequal to pushing the wind back into the sky. You can only tie the shutters, gather the children and the ledgers, and stand your ground. That night, the house rearranged itself around a dinner for 12 local worthies, arranged before the article and now perhaps sharpened by it. The Duke had returned from Scotland. He entered the drawing-room with the kind of grave beauty that makes people forgive a multitude of sins in advance. His eyes found Isabella at once, took a measure of the room, and came back to her as one returns to a fixed point on a map. "Good evening," he said, voice even. "Good evening." She could not read whether he had seen the Argus. The set of his mouth suggested he had seen and then set his mouth precisely for such an occasion. They received their guests like soldiers on a parade ground, each name an answered drum. Lady Wimborne, who wore malice like a scent. Sir Peregrine Marsh, whose moustache looked like a manifesto. Mrs. Ellery, whose love of gossip came wrapped in solicitude, like a sweet wrapped in paper that stuck to one's tongue. Talk swam and eddied. It took only a quarter-hour for Lady Wimborne to bring the Argus to the surface, like a fisherman smiling over a net. "We do admire a duchess with initiative," she said, letting the last word drip. Isabella lifted a glass and set it down, a small action to anchor a larger calm. "I admire anyone who does her work," she said. "Mine includes walking through my husband's concerns with my own eyes. One sees differently when one stands where other people stand." Sir Peregrine laughed in the tone of a man who keeps his heart in a decanter. "Most women would faint." "Most men," Isabella replied gently, "do not know how often women do not." Polite laughter flickered. The Duke did not move a muscle as if to call notice to her defence. He let the current carry her words out into the room. When Mrs. Ellery sighed and said, "But, dearest Duchess, is it quite seemly?" He spoke for the first time, his voice needing no volume to quiet the space. "Seemliness," he said, "is a category that interests the Argus more than it interests me. What interests me is whether the beams in the eastern gallery are sound." He drank, unhurried. "They were not. They are now." Silence. First shocked, then mollified, as if a stern schoolmaster had done a trick with a coin. Later, when the ladies withdrew and conversation turned to politics, which men mistake for reality because it is noisy, Isabella stood a moment in the conservatory alone, telling her heart to be less grateful than it wished to be. He had defended her because it was efficient to do so, because the house must present a single front, because appearances are currency, and yet gratitude, like water, found its small channels. She turned at the brush of a footstep. He stood in the doorway, shirt front impeccable, expression grave. "You did not need rescuing," he said. "No," she agreed, "but thank you for the reinforcement." "The Argus is a wasp nest," he said. "It stings what it fears." "And what does it fear?" "Women who require it to translate mercy into the language of ledgers." A flicker, then, like a small lantern, lit in the depth of his eyes. "You were right about Sheffield. Hughes is thorough in ways that serve Hughes." "Thank you for saying so." "I did not say it for gratitude." His gaze cut past her to the dark beyond the glass. "I said it because accuracy is a comfort in a house that hears so many rumors." He did not step further in. He did not use her name. He did not touch anything. She found she admired his restraint on its own terms. "There is more," she said. "Someone chose to send the Argus that letter. If it were only idle malice, they would have sent it to the Gazette as well. This was aimed." "Hughes?" He did not make the name a question. "Or someone who profits by his profits? The contractors? The men who sell us dear timber for poor props would prefer you never examined a single invoice." He glanced at her. "You are not frightened?" "I am," she said, "but fear is not a verdict." The next days unspooled with their usual sober grace, until the morning the barometer dropped like a stone. By noon, rain slashed the manor in diagonal strokes. By evening, the gutters struggled and lost. Wind laid its body along the windows and pushed. The girls were in the nursery after tea, listening, with varying degrees of attention, to Charlotte read Marco Polo. Isabella had just complimented Emma's valiant effort at stillness when Lily burst in without knocking. "Your Grace," she said, breathless, cheeks high with alarm. "Hawkins says the lower river has risen. It's over the track at Morton. The messenger has come from the village. There's flooding near the east cottages." Isabella could feel the house turn its head like a watchful animal. "Where is Mr. Hughes?" "Gone to his supper, Your Grace." "And his Grace?" "In the study with Mr. Ellison from the foundry." "Very well." Isabella kissed each girl's hair, because rituals hold even in weather, and went down the stairs fast enough to make propriety pant and give up. She found the Duke at the map table with Ellison, whose coat steamed. Both men looked up at the same instant, two halves of a compass rediscovering north. "The river's out at Morton," Ellison said without greeting. "We've pulled families into the church hall, but the east cottages are lower," Isabella finished, "and the lane is a trough." Ellison nodded, grateful for the speed of comprehension. "We need lanterns and blankets, and bread, and a cart that can be pushed when it cannot be pulled." Isabella turned. "Lily, alert the kitchens. Bread, soup, kettles. Mrs. Pembroke will know how to multiply kindness. Hawkins, lanterns, 2 dozen, and dry wood for the church stoves. And send a rider to the stables, the grey team on the big cart, chains, planks. Tell Thomas to bring his courage." "Your Grace," Hawkins said, already halfway out the door. She looked back to the map. "There's a second ford below the willow copses," she told Ellison, tracing the line with a finger. "The path's narrow, but if we won't use it," the Duke said. "It will be worse below the willows." "Not if we shore the edge with planks," Isabella countered. "The main lane will be a churn. The ford will be quicker." "This is not a debate," he said reflexively. Then he saw her face and altered, not capitulating, only correcting for accuracy. "It is a debate we will settle on the road." They went together, cloaks clapped to their throats, the door flung by the wind against Hawkins's shoulder so hard he would carry a bruise tomorrow and call it nothing. Rain hammered hats into submission. The cart lurched. Thomas grinned in terror. Lily swore softly at a wheel that preferred the ditch. Twice the water tried to make them change their minds. Twice the Duke's hand on the bridle and Isabella's hand on the cart's rim made refusal a matter of teamwork rather than pride. The church hall smelled of wet wool, clay, and whispered prayers. Mrs. Pembroke's soup, conjured from a larder she guarded like a dragon, steamed on trestles. Children with white faces and red noses sat in clusters like mushrooms. An old man with a wheeze nodded at Isabella as if she had come from somewhere that made him forgive all distances. "East Cottages," Ellison said, "and quickly." They went, the three of them, and two men with shoulders like barn doors. The lane was a river, as predicted. The ford below the willows was a devil's compromise. Once they nearly lost the cart. Once Isabella went to her knees in black water and came up laughing, because sometimes laughter is the lever that moves the world back into place. "Again," she said, hair a damp banner, and the Duke looked at her with a fierceness that had nothing to do with disapproval. They found the cottages with water talking at the thresholds, big talk that meant to get its way. A woman stood in a doorway with a baby to her chest, and a stubbornness that would have done as well in a siege. "It's only water," she said. "The stove's still lit." "It is not only water," Isabella said, taking her elbow. "Come, the stew will taste better if you eat it at the church. Who are you to tell me—" The woman stopped. "You're the Duchess." Suspicion and relief crossed her face like clouds. "My husband says you put buns in boys' hands." "I did," Isabella said. "I will again. Come." She did not appeal to duty or class or prudence. She appealed to appetite and warmth. The woman came. In the last cottage, a beam had shifted and lodged against a door. The house muttered ominously each time the wind breathed. Inside, a boy of 8 clung to the leg of a table as if it were a mast, his grandmother trying to pry his fingers loose. "He won't go," she said apologetically, as if she had invited the flood and now regretted making a spectacle. "He won't leave his father's boots." She gestured to a pair on the hearth, cracked leather, soles mended twice. "He thinks if he leaves them, Tom will be dead." Isabella knelt until she and the boy breathed the same wet air. "What's your name?" "Ben." "Ben," she said. "I will carry the boots. You will carry the stove's hottest coal in your pocket." She nodded toward the hearth. "We'll wrap it so it doesn't burn you. It will be like carrying fire to the church, and when you get there, your job will be to tell the fire where to live." He considered as only children consider, the scales, the cost, the hope. He nodded once. When Isabella rose, her knees hurt. She did not mention it. The Duke had already shouldered the beam aside, his jaw set, not in anger, but in effort. They moved as if they had always divided labour thus. Her voice, his strength, her coaxing, his lifting, both of them stubborn as rope. By midnight the worst had passed. The church's pews were quilts, the kettles were stories, the baby slept. When Isabella finally sat on a step near the door, drenched to the skin and ruinous to any sensible garment, the Duke came and stood beside her, as if the step had 2 corners that were both theirs. "You were right about the ford," he said simply. "You were right about the willows being worse," she returned, "because marriage is better when praise is exact." He looked at her hands, scraped and raw across the knuckles. He surprised both of them by taking one, just for a moment, just to turn it palm up, and frowning at a cut. "You will let Lily clean that," he said. "I will," she said. "And you will let someone sleep." "I do not sleep," he said before habit could be checked. Then he did the checking himself, and shifted. "I will lie down for an hour." "Good," she said, and smiled, because victory is not always legislation. Sometimes it is an hour on a hard bench. News travels faster than thank yous, but both arrived the next day. The Argus, discovering that the Duchess had carried boots through a flood, did not apologize. It does not belong to that religion, but it moderated its sneer to a smirk. In letters without signatures, people who had not been there approved. Isabella read none of them. She read instead the scrawl Charlotte left on her blotter. "Ben sent us a drawing of the coal in his pocket. It looks like a star that forgot its manners. Emma had added a wren. The weather broke clean as a promise." In that new light, another message came. This one not by paper, but by memory, knocking from the past like a guest who had been turned away too often and now refused to go. It arrived as a name whispered by Mrs. Pembroke when Isabella asked gently and without pry about the late Duchess. "Her Grace had a cousin," Mrs. Pembroke said, drying her hands. "A Mr. Lionel Ashton. He came often, some said too often." "Did his Grace approve?" Mrs. Pembroke's kind face tightened into a grimace she had not used for 20 years. "His Grace would not disapprove of the King if the King stood in his pantry. He sees and says nothing until the saying will break a board." "Did the cousin go away?" "He did," Mrs. Pembroke said. "The year before the accident." The accident. A word that tried to stuff a catastrophe into a thimble. Isabella had never asked. Grief is private property. She was not the woman to trespass with curiosity. Yet now she felt, not nosy, not ghoulish, responsible. A house haunted by secrets is a house that teaches children to whisper. She would not have Charlotte and Emma learn that fluency. She went first to Hawkins, who had a butler's memory of facts and a parish priest's discretion. "Her Grace died on the East Road," he said, eyes lowering because politeness is a veil that kindness wears. "The night was clear. The driver swore the wheels slipped on gravel thrown down by the roadmen. There had been storms. The carriage went over the bank. The second girl was still an infant." "And the cousin?" "Left for the colonies," Hawkins said. "Canada, some said. Others said he sailed and did not arrive. The house ceased to speak his name soon after, because remembering him was unkind." Unkind to whom? Isabella did not say it aloud. She thanked Hawkins and walked out into the gardens where the conservatory threw squares of light onto the grass. She had never loved gossip. She loved pattern. One name does not make a pattern. Two names begin to suggest one. She had a third name by evening, from Lily, who had heard it from the scullery maid, who had heard it from the footman, who had heard it from the stableman, who had shod the horse the night the carriage went out. Fenwick, the road foreman in charge of the repair. Fenwick, who had borrowed money from a contractor who charged too much and built with timber that splintered. Fenwick, who had a brother who had married a cousin of Hugh's. Fenwick, who had, incidentally, written to the Argus thrice about the wastefulness of nobility. Isabella did not run to the Duke with a net brimming with minnows. He did not like minnows. He liked fish he could weigh. She wrote the names instead, and the dates, on a card as clean as a gloved hand, and placed it under a paperweight of glass that had held sorrow once and now held facts. Days resumed their sober variety: lessons and maps, repairs in the village, a letter from Sheffield in which the mine manager, his punctuation all elbows, admitted the new props had held in a small slide that would otherwise have taken 2 men from their wives, a visit from Lady Harrington, who kissed Isabella's cheek as if she were sorry and proud at once, the quiet, locust-singing hum of a house rediscovering its uses. Then came the evening the Duke opened the conservatory door and stepped inside, not standing at the threshold as a man who debates entry, but as one who has decided to enter fully and bear the cost. Isabella looked up from the harp she had been teasing into tune. He stopped, not with the jerk of a man surprised, but with the smooth halt of a man who recognizes a room he has not allowed himself to see. "I have been to the East Road," he said. She set her hands in her lap. And the wheel did not slip on stones. His voice had the coolness of water poured from a jug that has been standing in shade. Phoenix men had grounds to throw down gravel. There had been storm, but they left the edge unsupported. He studied a point somewhere above her shoulder, the way men do when the ground under their feet has changed shape, and they require a fixed horizon. The bank was weakened by undercutting. The carriage did what carriages do when the world pulls at one wheel harder than the other. It went where gravity meant it to go. "I am sorry," she said. It was not the language one uses to wipe away bad weather. It was the language one uses to stand next to a person whose coat is on fire and not look away. "I have also spoken to Mrs. Pembroke," he continued, still not looking at her, "about Lionel Ashton. And my wife loved me," he said, the statement dry as a legal document and bleeding all the same. "She was foolish, as we are all foolish, dazzled by bright cousins and the oxygen of attention, but she was faithful. I know this because she told Mrs. Pembroke things she would not tell me, and because—" He stopped, then forced the sentence forward as a man forces a cart up a hill. "Because I have examined my own memory and do not find the evidence I chose to find when the house was drowned." She could hear what he was not saying in what he had said, that in the year after the accident, drowning had been his only occupation, that drowning men will blame the sea, the cliff, the cloud, the last hand that let go, themselves most of all, that in the absence of solid ground, a cousin makes a convenient island. He moved then, not toward her, but to the table where she kept the glass paperweight. He saw the card beneath and did not lift it. He placed his hand on the glass as if to hold down the small storm in the ink. "Hughes's contractors built the bank," he said quietly. "I will have the accounts tomorrow." She nodded and felt not triumph, but the hush that follows a prayer when the person realizes the prayer has been heard, perhaps imperfectly, perhaps by a God who is more earth than sky, but heard all the same. He let his hand fall. "You asked me once to look with the eyes I already possess. I did. I have done so," he said, "and I have found that grief is a poor optician." They stood in a silence that did not bruise. Outside, the last light made the grass imaginary. Inside, the harp's strings still held the shape of the chord she had played moments ago. He looked at the instrument, then at her. "Will you play?" "If you will sit," she said. It was a bargain small enough to pass under pride's gates without setting off the bells. He sat. She played, not a love song, something older and quicker, a tune that learned to run before it learned to walk. The sound made the conservatory cease to be a memorial and become a room. When she finished, he said quietly, "Thank you." "Thank you for asking," she returned. He stood, and something in him, which had been an address to a procession, softened into a man speaking to a woman in a peaceful room. "There is a ball next week," he said, almost rueful, "at Wimborne." "I am aware," she said. "We have bought ribbon and courage." "You will be stared at," he warned. "I am accustomed," she said. "I will stand with you," he said, and the sentence did not sound like efficiency. The Wimborne ball was orchestras and opinions. The chandeliers looked like ice attempting to impersonate fire. The Argus had sent a man with a notebook he pretended was a prayer book. Lady Wimborne looked like a person who believed forgiveness was vulgar. Isabella entered on the Duke's arm and felt the hush ripple like silk in a gallery where someone has hung a new painting, and no one is sure whether to praise or sputter. Charlotte and Emma were not here. 8 and 6 are too young for such theatres. But Isabella carried their names like amulets. She danced with men who wanted to see whether her scandal looked different up close. She danced with men who looked frightened of a woman who had walked in a mine. She danced with her husband. He led as before, exact, without show. But there was a thread of human warmth braided into the step now. At the far end of the room, near the palms, brought in to make the place look less like a place, a man with a thin mouth made a thin remark to a friend. Isabella did not hear the words. She heard the way the words were meant to land. She registered, as one registers thunder, the way the Duke pivoted the dance to bring them near enough to the thin mouth to require him to bow. He did, unwillingly. The Duke nodded as one nods to a person one has identified as a mosquito and chooses not to slap in public. At supper, a gentleman with ambition but not backbone approached, and in the careful tones of a toad pretending to be a nightingale, asked whether the Duchess would enlighten them as to the condition of the mining classes. The table prepared to be amused. Isabella drank a sip of water. She did not resent their appetite for spectacle, she only refused to feed it. "The condition of the mining classes," she said, "is that they do our burning for us. I consider it bad manners to mock a person who has kept your winter from killing you." She set down her glass. "But I can confirm that boys prefer sweets to sermons, and that a prop placed on Tuesday is better than a letter written on Wednesday." The table laughed, some with genuine pleasure, some with the relief of not having to choose their own courage. Later, the Argus would print a line about the Duchess's wit. Isabella would not buy the paper. When they returned to the manor long after midnight, the household asleep, the lamps in the hall burning low, Isabella untied her gloves at the base of the stairs, the silk refusing to surrender gracefully. He watched her, an ordinary thing, and beautiful for being ordinary. "You were remarkable," he said. "I spoke sense," she answered. "Remarkably," he said, and the smallest smile warmed his mouth as if it had been waiting for this line of weather to come across the hills. Lily appeared with a candle and vanished again, a good servant knowing when to be a ghost. Isabella took the rail to climb, then paused. "There is one thing more," she said over her shoulder, because the day's courage had paid for speech and she had a few coins left. "We must tell the girls plainly about their mother, the true parts and the kind parts. They have learned to read between lines no child should have to read. One story would do better than 100 whispers." He looked up at her, shadow on the stairs, making the line of his cheeks stern and oddly tender. "You will tell it," he said, "and I will be there." 2 days later, they sat in the conservatory with the girls, the harp quiet, the ferns newly watered, the afternoon soft enough to hold what it would. Isabella told the story the way one tells a child about the weather, describing the clouds without turning them into monsters, describing the sun without promising it every day. She said accident and also bank, and also men who should have done better. She said your mother loved you, and also your father broke and then did not. She did not say cousin. There was time for that later, when the girls were older, and the cousin could be a lesson and not a wound. Charlotte listened with the seriousness of a magistrate hearing a case that will set a precedent. Emma leaned against Isabella's side and counted her breaths. When it was done, Charlotte nodded, as if verifying an answer to a question she had written for herself. "Thank you," she said, formality rescuing feeling. Emma asked, "Will we see the road?" Isabella said yes. He said yes as well. After, when the girls ran to fetch paper and pencils because they had decided to draw the road with good props and fair weather, Isabella and the Duke remained in the green hush. He did not touch her. She did not expect him to. The new thing between them did not work like that. It worked like the way a house sounds different the week after a baby is brought home. Same walls, same furniture, but a different grammar of quiet. He said, "I told myself for years that my heart was dead." "I know," she said. "It was not dead," he went on, as if he owed accuracy to the past as much as to the present. "It was under rubble. You have a talent for removing rubble without collapsing the house." "Not a talent," she said. "A stubbornness." He inclined his head, conceding the point. "However you name it, I am grateful." The word went through her not like a trumpet or a drum, but like heat into cold hands. She did not reach for him. She did not need to. Instead, she said very simply, "You are welcome." And when he looked at her, for once not past her, not through her, not at her as one studies a cipher, but as a man looks at the person who has been beside him in a flood, she knew that the crack in his armor was no longer a crack. It was a door, not yet open, but unlocked. That night, when the house slept, Isabella sat at her dressing table and wrote a letter without a name at the top. "I have been wrong about many things," she wrote to the part of herself that trembled in storms and made jokes at funerals. "I have been right about a few. I was right that mercy is not a weak thing. I was right that children bloom in weather we make on purpose. I was right that a house will learn the grammar of a different silence if one person refuses to whisper. And I was wrong about hearts that declare themselves dead. They can be coaxed, not by pleading, but by work, not by spectacle, but by presence, not by making a show of love, but by making a life in which love finds a chair and sits down without being announced." She sealed the letter and put it in the drawer with the others. The rain had returned, not as catastrophe, but as sound. Somewhere in the house, Emma laughed in her sleep. Somewhere else, Charlotte turned a page. In his room at the far end of the corridor, the Duke set his candle down and did not sit at his desk. He lay down, as he had said he would, and slept. The east road looked smaller in daylight than it had in memory. Grass had claimed the raw edges. The new props bit into the bank like good teeth. Isabella and the Duke stood where the line of ruts tipped toward the repaired verge. Charlotte and Emma were in the gig with Lily, given the duty of counting crows and reporting any that looked like metaphors. The air carried the honest smell of earth that had been moved on purpose. "It is an ordinary place," Isabella said at last. "It is," he answered. "Most catastrophes are. The extraordinary arrives afterward, in the stories we tell about them." They walked the length of the repair and back, saying nothing a long time, as if to give the ground a chance to speak. It had only one language: held, shored, enough. When they returned to the manor, the day presented its work like a tray of letters, some stamped urgent, some addressed in familiar hands. Mrs. Pembroke reported a shortage of flour that required a dance with the miller's schedule. Hawkins requested a word regarding the condition of the north wing's roof. The head gardener asked whether the Duchess preferred peonies to roses. The steward, Mr. Hughes, sent nothing. That in itself was a letter of a kind. By evening, a note arrived from a solicitor in town, dry, efficient, carrying news like a draught carries medicine. Upon examination of the ledgers and contracts related to the East Road repair, there appear irregularities sufficiently weighty to draw the eye of any honest court. There were names: Phoenix, a contractor 2 degrees removed from Hughes, a bank that lent at a rate only usury calls prudence. At the bottom, a line: "His Grace's instructions are requested." The Duke read it twice and slid it to Isabella. She read it once and looked up. They did not discuss whether to act. They discussed how. He sent for Hughes the next morning. Hughes arrived with a composure one admires in bridges and distrusts in men. He bowed. He stood. He arranged his face into the expression of a person congratulating himself on having been misunderstood. "I have questions," the Duke said. "You will provide answers?" "Gladly, Your Grace." "Did you authorize the use of Treacher brown timber for the East Road props?" "I did, Your Grace." "At a rate 10% higher than the fair market?" "They are prompt, Your Grace." "So are thieves," he said mildly. "Did you recommend Fenwick for the foreman's post on the East Road crew after he had been dismissed from Caddington for negligence?" Hughes blinked. Men glance. Liars blink. "Dismissed?" "I was not aware." "I was," the Duke said, "because I asked. After my wife died." He did not raise his voice for her name. He did not need to. The room heard. "Why did you not ask?" Hughes's lips thinned. "It is possible I was misinformed." "It is certain," Isabella said, "that you were insufficiently curious." He turned to her with that particular condescension he reserved like a polished spoon. "Your Grace has, if I may, a distaste for custom." "I have a distaste for rot," she said. "And for anyone who profits by it." The Duke laid a hand flat against the desk, as if to steady a ship that wanted to yaw. "You have served this house for years," he said. "Service is not ownership. You will present to me by end of day an accounting of every contract let in the past 5 years in which a relation, by blood or by debt, touched the funds of this estate. You will then take a fortnight's leave in town while my solicitor examines your work. If I find you have been merely careless, you will be dismissed with a letter that emphasizes your accuracies. If I find you have been corrupt, I will prosecute you. Do you understand me?" Hughes understood him. He understood him very well. People sometimes mistake cool for leniency. Hughes did not make that mistake again. When Hughes had left, stiff as a man going to a doctor for a diagnosis he already knows, Isabella stood very still. The Duke did not look triumphant. He looked, as he had the day they spoke in the conservatory, accurate. "You will be blamed," she said quietly. "There will be those who call it unseemly to ruin a man who, by most measures, has run things tolerably for a long time." He nodded once. "There will also be those whose beams hold." She stepped to the desk and covered his hand with hers. Perhaps it was bold, perhaps it was only exact. He did not pull away. "You will not carry it alone," she said. "I do not intend to," he answered, and his hand, so precise in all things, turned, his fingers closing around hers with a steadiness that had nothing to do with signature and everything to do with vow. The weeks that followed taught the house a new rhythm. The old steward's measured retreat, the arrival of Mr. Pritchard, a temporary auditor with an expression like a fence post and the honesty of one. The staff watched, wary and hopeful in equal measure. Hawkins went on being a pillar, Mrs. Pembroke went on multiplying flour by kindness. Miss Winters, sensing the ground under her rules shift, became not softer but truer. She corrected with less scorn. She sat with Emma through a hard hour of sums and did not call tears a sin. When Charlotte asked with precarious composure whether capitals changed when countries changed their minds, Miss Winters did not say capitals mustn't. She said, "Sometimes they do." Isabella took the girls to the village on the first Saturday of May. They wore plain cloaks with good pockets for tucking up acquired treasures, a blue-feathered jay's plume, a stone shaped like an egg, a receipt for 2 penny buns that Emma insisted on keeping because it was proof of happiness. At the far end of the green, a poster flapped on a wall. "Meeting of the miners' wives, Wednesday next, at the schoolroom." Isabella felt pride and worry tug each other's sleeves. "Will you go?" Charlotte asked. "Only if I am invited," Isabella said. "Rooms like that are for women to speak who are not always heard. Too many ladies talk where listening is required." Emma took her hand. "You listen," she said, as if reporting on weather. They were invited. Mrs. Wilkes, who had once asked what ladies knew of men coughing black, sent a boy with a folded note that smelled of onion and soap and courage. "Come and sit, Duchess, and not at the front. Bring no paper. Bring only your ears." Isabella smiled when she read it. She brought no paper. In the schoolroom, benches had been pulled from everywhere a bench could be found. The women spoke with the economy of people whose words must do work. They spoke of wages that slid 2 pennies down on Thursdays and somehow did not slide back up on Saturdays, of a foreman who pinched, a clock, a waist, of a pump that groaned and was given a day's rest when it needed an overhaul. Isabella kept her hands clasped and her mouth shut. When at last Mrs. Wilkes said, "Well?" Isabella did not make a speech. She said, "Thank you," and then, "I can do 5 things immediately. Tell me which 3 you prefer." They chose the pump, the foreman, and the pennies. She did the 3, and a week later the other 2 besides. The Argus found new targets. It is the nature of wasps to fly to fresh sugar. It stung a duke who had, scandal of scandals, permitted his daughters to attend Sunday prayers sitting with their governess instead of staged like porcelain at the front pew. Isabella expected a pang of the old anger. She felt instead the simple, weary patience of a person who knows that paper burns. The day the solicitor delivered the report on Hughes, the sky blued like an apology. The report was as clean as a ledger copied by a schoolboy terrified of blots. It gave numbers. It gave names. It gave treachery the exact size of its whole. The Duke dismissed Hughes without drama. He did not relish it. He did not avoid it. He sent a note to the magistrate with a packet attached and a line at the bottom. I have known you a long time. I trust your eyes more than my temper. Hughes did not go to prison. He went to a small town 2 counties away with a letter that was not quite damning and not remotely glowing. Treacher Brown lost their contract and discovered that oak, when bought honestly, does not rot. The day after the dismissal, the manor inhaled differently, as if freed from a corset. Isabella noticed it in small things. Lily hummed without apologizing. Mrs. Pembroke sent sugared almonds up to the schoolroom, not because it was a holiday, but because surviving scandal should occasionally be fed sweets. Miss Winters permitted a story before copywork, and did not call it indulgence. Charlotte's hand, always careful, showed the beginnings of a flourish that was not vanity, but confidence. Emma climbed a tree halfway, and then climbed back down with a solemnity born of good sense rather than fear. The house learned a sound like laughter that had not negotiated terms with despair before entering. On a certain evening, as spring swelled into a summer that was ready to spend itself, Isabella found a book on the table in the conservatory. It was old, bound in leather that had once been proud. Inside the front cover, a neat hand, female, had inscribed, "For days when silence is not enough." The rest was blank. It was a ledger of another kind, a book for music. Isabella touched the first empty stave as if greeting a new country. He entered without announcement. He did not pretend he had not meant to find her. "May I sit?" he asked, and she realized it was not the room he asked permission of. "You may," she said. He sat in the chair he had sat in before, as if a map from that night had been left on the cushions. She took the harp, no soft love tune, not yet, a set of notes like stepping stones over a stream. When she finished, he did not speak immediately, and she did not rush to fill the space with talk. She had learned that the gentleman she had married needed time to turn certain words over like coins and ensure they were not counterfeit before spending them. "I have thought about what you said," he began, "on the night of the flood. You said fear is not a verdict." "I did. Grief was mine," he went on. "Then fear. I made both into verdicts and called it character. It was easier." "Easier is not always dishonest," she said. "Sometimes it is a kindness we apply like a salve, because bleeding must be stopped before bone can be set." He looked down, not to avoid her eyes, but to consult his own. "I told myself my heart had died. It had not. You said rubble. You were correct." A pause, then a turn one could not force a man to make. "I have also told myself I cannot love you." She kept her breath even. "You told me you would not feign what you did not feel." "I believed you." "I did not feign," he said. "I do not intend to. But a thing has happened that does not fit the statement I made on our wedding day." She waited. "I find," he said, voice low and precise, "that I look for you. In rooms, in sentences, in the laughter the girls have relearned, in the sound a house makes when it is more alive at night than it was in the morning. I find that my hand, this one," he flexed it as if it belonged to someone else, "has learned the measure of your hand without being taught. I find that when you contradict me, I am wrong as often as I am right, and the discovery pleases me more than it irritates me. I find that I want—" He stopped, corrected for accuracy. "No, that I choose. Plain speech." He met her eyes at last. "I love you." She had told herself for months a story about not needing this sentence to do her work. It had been true. It was also true that when he said it, something inside her that had been well-fed and strong and sufficient stood up and stepped forward to take a crown it had not asked for, but which fit. She did not reach to him immediately. She did what she had made a practice of doing with gifts. She let it sit between them a moment and be itself. "Thank you," she said, because gratitude is the first courtesy when the world gives you more than you dared write down. Then, because she too dealt in plain speech, she answered, "I love you." He exhaled with a small, astonished sound, as if the organ in his chest, newly excavated, had discovered it could hold more air than it used to. "Isabella," he said then, her name an unpracticed instrument, learning its notes. "May I?" She crossed the distance. His hands, so disciplined, left discipline and learned touch. The kiss was not theatrical. It did not try to prove anything to a gallery. It was the first drink after a long thirst, the first step taken barefoot on grass after months of winter floors. He tasted like the day had tasted at the East Road, held, shored, enough. They drew apart because living requires air. He touched her face with the back of his fingers in an old-fashioned gesture that made mockery a sin. "I cannot promise to be a different man every hour," he said, still exact, still himself. "I can promise to be changed by the hours." "And I," she said, "cannot promise to be endlessly patient with your habits, but I can promise to be faithful to the best in you and to the best in me, even when the worst knocks loudly." He laughed under his breath, a sound that had made itself scarce for too long and now seemed ready to be useful. "We are well matched," he said. "We are," she agreed. "And not by accident." The next morning, the girls, who possess the mysterious instruments by which children hear things no walls can keep from them, looked between their father and their stepmother as if they had been given a new map to study. Emma clapped, because some joys receive applause. Charlotte did not clap. She straightened her slate on the table with great dignity and said, "Shall we add Venice to our list, father?" Which was, in Charlotte's language, a benediction. He said, "We shall," and, as if to seal the decree, kissed the tops of both their heads in turn with a warmth that surprised the room and, surely, himself. Summer drew itself auspiciously across the lawn. There were families at the East cottages who ate better. There were props in the mines that held. There were wages that slid neither up nor down without reason. There was a steward who did his sums without considering his cousins first. There was an afternoon in June when Isabella and the Duke planted a sapling along the East Road, and Charlotte read aloud a poem she had written about beams that wanted to be honest, and Emma declared herself the warden of puddles and accepted her office with cake. There were letters. The Argus, smelling less sugar, printed a piece about improvements in the northern interests without admitting why. The Gazette, less vain, ran a line about a duke who had learned to answer to accuracy before tradition. Her father wrote from Bath that the debts were gone, and he had discovered he liked walking at dawn, a fact that would have embarrassed him last year and now made him cheerful. There were reconciliations and small revolutions in rooms where such things rarely occurred. Miss Winters, one evening when the girls had been put to bed and silence was lawful, knocked on Isabella's sitting-room door and stood much as she had stood the day of the rabbit, rigid, proud, frightened. "I have been wrong," she said, in a voice that belonged to a woman younger than the one her body held. I thought gentleness would break them. It did not. It mended me. Isabella did not take advantage of the moment to preach. She said, "So much the better," and poured tea. Miss Winters cried exactly 3 tears into the cup and told no one. Isabella told no one she had counted. There were changes one did not put in ledgers. The conservatory recovered its green. The harp learned new songs. Lantern light at night stopped looking like vigilance and began to look like invitation. Hawkins told a joke at table so dry one could have used it for tinder, and the kitchen staff drank to it with tea they pretended was stronger. The hall boy, Thomas, learned to read with Emma's help, and presented Isabella with a thank you written in the most careful hand the North had ever seen. Charlotte corrected his commas gently, and did not call him stupid when he forgot a silent letter. There were, in time, sorrows. People die even when beams hold. Crops fail, even when bills are paid on time. Children scrape knees. Men take cold. A carriage overturned on the West Road one October afternoon in a shower of leaves. The wheel caught by a rut deep as a promise. No one died. 2 arms were broken. The house learned again how to make broth and how to sit by beds without insisting that pain make a speech. They bore it and did not make tragedy their profession. There were, too, conversations that felt like cresting hills. One afternoon, nearly a year from the day at St. George's, the Duke came to the nursery at an unaccustomed hour and found Isabella on the floor with Emma and Charlotte, constructing Venice out of paper islands and string canals. He stood in the doorway as if he had just arrived at a harbour. "I have been to the lawyer," he said, when Emma had finished pirouetting a paper gondola beneath a chair bridge. "I have altered the settlements." Isabella raised a brow. "It is practical," he added, in case she mistook it for sentiment. "If anything should happen to me, the mines will not revert to men who consider men expendable. The household is yours, entirely. The girl's guardianship is yours, entirely. You already carry the weight. It is honest to give you the lever." She sat back on her heels. The girls stared, confused by the adult language, aware it mattered. Isabella did not make an aria of gratitude. She knew better than to dress justice in praise. "That is good," she said simply. "Thank you." He inclined his head, and then, privately, when the girls were putting away their floating city, added in a voice that belonged to no court but the one where 2 people hold jurisdiction, "It is also that I cannot imagine a world in which someone else writes this house's grammar." "Nor I," she said. Autumn came, and the house wore it like a shawl it had inherited and finally learned to like. On All Hallows the village children paraded masks of paper and paste. Emma tried to be frightened and failed delightedly. On the first Sunday of Advent, Charlotte held a candle steady as a law and did not drip wax on her gloves. When the first snow arrived, Isabella stood at the window with the Duke and watched the lawn be erased and rewritten. He rested his palm on the sill, close enough to hers that warmth travelled without show. "What is left to do?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "Which is to say, life." He nodded, as a man nods when told the journey he feared is only the road by another name. "Then we will do it." They did. They did it in ordinary hours and long days and nights when no crisis and no celebration required them to make speeches. They did it in the way a person learns to leave doors open where once he locked them, and to light lamps where once he darkened halls, as if grief were a house guest to be indulged forever. They did it by teaching two girls that love is not a performance required at the front pew, but a discipline practiced at the back door, where boots are muddy and soup is ladled and people forgive each other for walking in with the weather still clinging to their coats. On a morning in late winter, when the sky looked like paper and the world smelled like smoke and patience, Isabella woke early. She lay still and listened. The house was breathing. Somewhere a fire caught properly. Somewhere a child turned in bed and sighed. Somewhere, far off, men on a morning shift shouldered lunch pails and chose not to spit when the wind blew back in their faces. Beside her, the man who had once told her his heart had died slept with his mouth soft, his hand open, not making a fist of anything. She rose and wrapped herself and walked the corridor. At the nursery door she paused, not to eavesdrop, but to honor a custom she had learned by accident. At dawn, children sleep most beautifully. Charlotte had kicked off her blanket and retained her dignity. Emma hugged Mr. Whiskers with the seriousness of an oath. Isabella tucked the blanket around Charlotte and kissed the rabbit's worn ear, because one loves what one loves in the ways it can receive love. When she returned to their room, he was awake. He lifted the coverlet in invitation and good manners. She slipped beneath, cold toes finding warm shin, marriage arguing successfully for its own virtues. "I dreamed," he said into her hair. "Of what?" "A road that held," he said. He thought, then added, "and of puddles that could be crossed without being told no." She smiled against his throat. "The warden of puddles will approve." She approves of all insolences that lead to kindness. They lay quiet. Outside, the sky considered complicity with the sun. The day would ask them for letters and bread and beams and harp practice and a decision about whether Miss Winters ought to be permitted to teach Latin to girls. The day would receive, from two people who had learned the arithmetic of mercy, the correct answer, yes. In the spring that followed, there was a small private ceremony on the East Road. No paper attended, and no one made a speech. A tree they had planted had taken root, its buds considered leaf. Charlotte read, as she always wished to read, the last lines of a book that had earned its ending. Emma hung a ribbon, green naturally, on the lowest branch, and declared the road a friend rather than a memory that frightened steps. Isabella and the Duke stood with hands knit because the wind preferred to tangle them and because habit had become instinct. The world went on being itself, stubborn, imperfect, generous. They went on being themselves, stubborn, imperfect, generous. The house learned a grammar of quiet in which love did not need to shout to be heard. And in June, on a morning when the conservatory glass made squares of light on the floor and the harp's strings were warm under her fingers just from the sun, Isabella found a new book on the table. The first was the ledger for music. This one held pages ruled for words. On the flyleaf, in a careful, exacting hand that had learned softness without sacrificing precision, someone had written, "For the life we did not plan, and the love we chose to make of it." She ran her fingers over the ink as one runs fingers over a familiar face, to be sure it is real. Then she took up a pen, not to write a speech or a report or a set of instructions to hold up beams, but to write plain as a vow, held, shored, enough,